Well, today we're going to be beginning a brand new series, and then this series is going to be called In the Fight. And we're going to be looking, and we're beginning this message series by introducing it with Paul's letters to the Ephesians. We're looking at chapter 6, where Paul tells the Ephesians that they are in the fight, that they are in a battle. And throughout this series, we're going to be looking in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're going to be looking at the situations of some of God's people who were fighting God's battles. What we'll see is that when we surrender our lives to God, things aren't always going to be going easy. It's not going to be smooth sailing from that time on, because there is a battle raging, and sometimes we get knocked off our feet. All too often what happens, though, is people come to the Lord after hearing a message about life enhancement. They'll hear these messages about how much better their lives are going to be, and God will take care of this and God will take care of that. And that is all true. But sometimes these messages make it appear as if we're not going to have any problems in our lives from that day forward. But the truth is, we will have problems. We will have problems in this life. What Paul is telling us is quite the opposite from a life enhancement message. What Paul is telling us is that we are in the fight. We are in a battle regardless, and it's simply a matter of whose side we're fighting on. When we surrender our lives to God, we're still going to be in the battle. But Paul shares with us the way we are to prepare for the battle and how God is with us in the battle. God is with us in the fight. What we will be discovering is that this battle is unavoidable. And that is the title of today's message. Throughout this series, we're going to see how God strengthens his people and prepares them as they're in the fight. Now, have you ever been in a situation of conflict where you were in conflict and it was just simply unexplainable? You just couldn't explain the fact that you're in this conflict, but you don't know why. Things have come against you and you just don't understand it. You've always tried to do the right thing. You've always tried to help others. You always tried to do what you thought was right, but for some reason, things just come against you. Or in a situation where you find yourself saying, things should be easier than this. Especially, like I said, when you know in your heart that you're doing the right thing. Maybe you're in a situation like that right now. Maybe you're in a situation where there's unexplainable conflict in your life. It could be a work situation. You could have a problem with a coworker. You could be having a problem with a boss. You could be having a problem with a client, a work situation where it's just unexplainable. Like, why is it so difficult? This should be easier than this. Or a friend who, for no reason that you can explain, has become difficult or even hostile towards you. I remember a time when I was a letter carrier working in the city of Bethlehem. And at the time, I was the vice president of the local union branch there. And I remember at this specific time where the president began having some problems. The president began to be like absentee and forgetting things and letting the ball drop on some important things. And, we were asking him what was going on, and it was becoming apparent that there was a problem. So we thought, well, we have to confront him and we have to say, hey, look, what's going on? Maybe you need to step down a little bit. Maybe you need to take some time away. And we did this. And his response was, there's no problem. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And, if you just don't like it, maybe you guys can drop out. And we noticed that the problems just persisted and persisted until finally one day I said, look, I thought, maybe if we just told him how serious we were, that he would get the message and step down. And I said, look, if you don't step down, then I'm just going to run against you. And then that will get you out that way. Thinking that would make him step down. But quite the opposite happened. He just dug in and I had made my decision, and he had made his decision, and now we were in this conflict with one another. But what was astounding to me, what I found in this situation that was most difficult for me to explain, was how people who were my friends, people who were my coworkers, people who I worked with every day came against me. They came against me, and they were saying things about me and behind my back and to my face and to other coworkers about things that weren't true, were simply untrue. And I just kept getting in this battle and I couldn't wait for this election to finally be over. And when it was over, I lost the election. And the person who was the problem stayed in the position as president, and I was on the outside looking in. And I thought I was doing the right thing. I knew in my heart I was doing the right thing. But things still came against me. In that situation, it was hard for me to understand why things were coming against me. When we do what we believe is the right thing, we believe that everything should simply fall into place. When we feel that we're doing the right thing, we believe that everyone around us should see things the way that we see things. But that doesn't always happen. When we are in these situations, we may not see things happen the way we believe that they should. What we need to look for, though, is how God is working in all of our situations. Because God is always at work. God is at work in things that will make sense to us eventually. Usually when we look back on a situation, we have a better understanding of what God was doing in the middle of it. But we cannot sometimes see what God is doing when we're in the middle of it. So sometimes we need to make that conscious effort to just look around us and wonder and pray and ask, God, what are you doing in this situation? Now, things for me eventually did work out in this situation. The president was still fraught with all kinds of problems. His problems didn't go away. And 9 months later, he had to resign. And my close friend, who was running as vice president for me, now became president. And he appointed me to be his vice president. And so I was able to once again go back to my former position as vice president. But in the time when this was happening, I couldn't see why things were coming against me. I couldn't see why these forces were coming against me. I believe that Paul wrote this letter to the churches in Ephesus while he was in prison in Rome. It is believed by many that this is the case. Now, Paul was in Ephesus for about 3 years, and Ephesus was kind of his base of operations. He was there on one of his missionary journeys, and while he was going around, he would keep returning to Ephesus, and he was planting churches all around that region there in Ephesus, and that was his home base. But now he was taken prisoner, and he was being taken to Rome, and while he was waiting to stand trial in Rome, he was writing letters, and he wrote this letter to the church in Ephesus. Paul knew what it was like to struggle and to have people and circumstances come against him as he was doing the Lord's work. Paul was facing one of those times when he wrote this letter from prison in Rome to the people of Ephesus. Paul also knew that the young believers in the new churches that he established were going to face difficulties and struggles as they continued the work that he had started. Paul was writing to the Ephesians to encourage them and to let them know that they would face struggles if they haven't already or weren't in the midst of them as they received this letter. See, Paul didn't want to leave the Ephesians or any of the other churches that he established or anyone who was doing the work of God. He didn't want to leave them with a false sense that everything was going to be smooth. Everything was going to be great and smooth and no problems. He wanted them to know that there was a battle raging and that they were in the fight. Paul wanted them to know where these struggles and conflicts were coming from and how they were to prepare themselves to stand against him. Paul told the Ephesians that there are unseen forces at work here. Now, for some of you, this may be something that seems a little out there. This may seem to you like when you're talking about spiritual world and spiritual battles and things, it's just a little out there. It's just a little off my radar. Something I don't really know if I want to really get into. Some of you may wrestle with what is commonly known as the spirit world. We have trouble sometimes accepting what we don't understand, and especially things that we can't see. But I believe that for most of us, we can agree that sometimes things happen. Sometimes things happen that are good, and sometimes things happen that are bad, that we simply just can't explain. Have you ever had a stroke of good fortune and you just looked around and said, hey, well, maybe somebody up there likes me? Or maybe when things weren't going so good, when things were just coming against you and you just felt like you were in a battle, you were in a struggle, you just couldn't go on anymore, and you were just like, just going, looking around and speaking to no one in particular and just looking and saying, would somebody just please give me a break? So I believe that all of us do have some understanding of the spiritual world, even if we have a hard time understanding or even accepting it. Paul tells the Ephesians that they are in the fight, that they are to find their strength in the Lord and to guard against these unseen forces. Paul also makes it clear, and this is a very important distinction, that he makes it clear that we are not in a battle against each other, that it is not people per se that we are fighting against, but it is the forces that influence people to do the things that they do. Because what Paul is saying is that it's not the people, even though it might be your neighbor or your coworker or somebody who's coming against you. It may be somebody who's spreading rumors about you. It may be somebody that's doing these things. It's not the person, it's the evil that's influencing that person that is coming against us. Paul is telling us, as he's telling the Ephesians, that these are the battles that we're fighting. Because what Paul is telling us here is that we shouldn't write people off because we see them in a negative light. But know that if they can be influenced by evil, that they can also be influenced by good. So Paul makes it clear that we are not fighting against people. For when it is people who come against us, Paul says we're not fighting against them. It's not flesh and blood, but it's the spiritual forces, the evil forces that influence them. See, if we don't realize this, then it may cause us to harbor an unforgiving spirit. And when we ourselves harbor an unforgiving spirit, then we are also under the influence of the evil forces that Paul is speaking about. Have you ever had that kind of situation where you just felt you couldn't forgive someone? You know that the right thing is to forgive somebody, but there's just something about it that you're saying, like, I just can't do it. Because that is the evil forces speaking to us, influencing us, and giving us that unforgiving spirit. So Paul wants us to be cautious that we are not influenced by those same forces. This is why Paul is telling us not just who to guard against, but what we are to guard against. Paul tells the Ephesians that they are in the fight. He tells the Ephesians that this fight is unavoidable, so they must prepare themselves to guard against the attacks that they are going to face. Since Paul is speaking about preparing for battle, for preparing to be in the fight, he uses a military metaphor for making his point. He makes this metaphor about the military garments of his time. And in Paul's day, soldiers would put on full suits of armor as they were preparing to go into battle. Now, Paul places a spiritual significance on each one of these pieces of armor. Now, today, soldiers still wear battle gear. Now, the garments may be different, But the soldiers still wear battle gear as they're preparing to go into battle, as they're still preparing to go into the fight. So Paul tells us that there's a spiritual significance to these garments, to look at them with a spiritual significance. Though even though ours are different today, what Paul is telling the Ephesians is still applicable to our lives today. Because Paul tells us that the way to prepare for this battle is to wear truth and righteousness as body armor. If we are to stand our ground against the forces that come against us, then we must know the truth. We must have a desire to know and to understand truth. And this is a lifetime endeavor. It's not something that simply happens overnight. We must have that constant thirst and that constant hunger and desire to know truth. Because if we don't know truth, we will be easily influenced by smooth talkers with a convincing argument, which will lead us away from the truth. And Paul also says that we are to wear a garment of righteousness. Now, righteousness is simply to have a right relationship with God, meaning that we line ourselves up with the things that are important to God. And this too is another lifelong endeavor. We should always strive and to desire to have a right relationship with God. Knowing the truth will keep us facing in the right direction with our relationship with God. Paul is encouraging the Ephesians and us as well to stand our ground and not to give 1 inch of ground that we have conquered. Otherwise, the forces that come against us will be able to overcome us and to take us captive as well. So Paul also said that we are to stand in faith. Stand in faith, because it is faith that will shield us from the onslaught of the enemy's weaponry. Now, we may never fully know all truth, and there may be times when our relationship with God won't always be the best it could be, but it is faith that will get us through these battles. Faith that God is with you no matter what. Now, there will be times, and you may have already experienced times, that it didn't feel that God was with you. But we have to take it on faith that God is always with us. God is always with you, whether you can feel his presence or not. And we must take that on faith, especially in those times when we feel that God is far away. The forces that come against us are the forces that are opposing God himself. We must always remember that this is God's battle, and we are not fighting our own battle, but we are fighting God's battle. And Paul tells us that the final weapon that we have in our arsenal is prayer. Paul tells us to pray in the Spirit in every occasion. We are to pray for everything, making all kinds of requests. We are to be alert and pray not only for ourselves, but also for others who are in the same fight. Prayer is simply having a conversation with God. We must remember that when Paul is talking about being in constant prayer, that he's talking to us about being in a constant communication, a constant conversation with God. When he says that we're supposed to constantly be in prayer, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're supposed to constantly be on our knees physically. But what Paul is telling us is that to have that open channel of communication with God at all times. Paul makes it clear that we are in the fight, that this fight is unavoidable. There is a battle, and we have to decide which side we are on. But whatever we choose, we are in the fight. We will either be fighting with God or we will be fighting against him. But either way, we're in the fight. It's unavoidable. Paul encourages us to stand our ground, because one of the weapons of the forces of evil is to tell us that there is an easier way, that there is no battle, and that we shouldn't have to fight. You may have had an experience where people in the church came against you. You may have been hurt by God's people. But Paul encourages us not to walk away, but to stay in the fight. The forces of evil would encourage you to walk away from the faith. After all, who needs this kind of aggravation? The battle plan of the forces of evil are to draw people away from God. That's why it's so tempting to walk away from the faith, especially when it's God's people that are coming against us, when we have a bad church situation. But that is one of the battle plans of the forces of evil. Paul talks to us and he says this is the devil's scheme. And he will use any means to achieve his objective, which is simply to lead people away from God. Paul tells us that to be prepared for this battle, we must put on truth, righteousness, and faith. We are to be ready with the gospel of peace. The gospel of peace, which is interesting because Paul is talking about being ready for battle. The gospel of peace is the key component to winning this battle. Because we're not to simply stand our ground, but to gain ground and win those who would come against us. And it is the gospel, it is the good news of Jesus who has already won the battle for us, that we are to bring to those who come against us. We are to bring that gospel, that good news, to those who come against us. We're not supposed to look down on them and say, well, they don't deserve it. But we should look to them with mercy and grace, the same mercy and grace that God has shown us, and share with them the gospel of truth. We are in the fight. It's unavoidable. The outcome for each one of us depends on who we are fighting for. The battle is God's. It's God's battle against the forces of evil, which initially came against him. If you stand up for God, forces will come against you. The only question is, are you prepared to be in the fight?